lecture on the Americas from the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Incas. So this is going to be a three-part lecture that's dealing with those three Native American civilizations. So what we see here is this picture of this Native American, and he is growing maize, or corn, as we call it here in the United States. Now, the reason I start with this slide is because if you're ever going to have a large-scale civilization with advanced social classes and large public works projects like pyramids, you're going to need to have an abundance of food. You can't be hunter-gatherers. Well, it's hard to be hunter-gatherers and have a large-scale complex civilization. You need to have an excess food supply, and maize is going to provide that. And so these Native Americans are going to grow a lot of maize, a lot of corn, so much that they don't have to have everybody in their society being a farmer. You now can have people who are specialized workers, artisans, priests, warriors, rulers. These are all the people that kind of govern society and help it become more advanced. And so this becomes the key, right? Being able to have a good enough soil, a good enough temperature, good enough rainfall that you're able to grow this abundance of food to support other non-farming workers. And that creates an advanced civilization. So the first civilization we're going to talk about in part one is the Mayans. The Mayan civilization lasts from around 300 to 1100 CE or AD, and they are primarily located here on the Yucatan Peninsula, which is right here. This is where you're going to see Mayan ruins today. Now, the Mayans were blessed with almost everything they needed to have an abundance of crops. They had lots of rain. It's a very tropical area. They also have lots of sunshine, but the one thing they are lacking is good soil. This soil has lots of lime in it, and it's very thin, and it's not very fertile. And so even though you have sunshine and rain, you're not going to be able to grow a lot of crops, which means if you can't grow a lot of crops, you can't have a large-scale civilization with surplus workers to do other things. So what the Maya did is they invented the system to help kind of create good soil. So in the Yucatan Peninsula, there is a little bit of good soil, but it usually gets washed away in these rainstorms, and it gets washed away into the river. And so here we have these little particles of good soil that is in the river. Now, what the Mayan did is they built these kind of raised up areas underneath the water that would catch the good soil. The soil tends to sink over time, and it would just kind of build up right here under the river because the Mayas built this kind of catch system. Then the Maya, what they would do is they would trap some of this silt with their little catch system, and then they would reach down underneath the water, scoop up that collected good soil, and then take it back to their farmland and dump it on their farmland. And so now they have all the ingredients you need to raise maize, which means they can raise a lot of it, which means they can have now an advanced civilization of other workers besides farmers. The other crops they grew besides maize, and we see maize being grown right here, is they also grew cotton. So this lady is wearing clothes made out of cotton, so that helps clothe them. And they also grow cacao, which of course is the main ingredient for where chocolate comes from. And so these are some of the main things, the native crops that they're able to domesticate for their uses. Now, the Maya did not have a strong centralized empire. They did not have one central emperor who controlled the whole civilization. What they are is they're divided up into a series of city-states. So if this is the Yucatan Peninsula, right, what we're going to do is we'll have a city here, and a city here, and a city here, and maybe one over here. And what they do is each city kind of governs the area around their city-state. But they're never united into one empire. And so each of these city-states at their city center have a ruler who governs this area. But that's it. And so when you have a country that's kind of governed by one city, that's called a city-state. And of course, these city-states are always going to be warring against each other. Now these cities, even though I'm calling them cities, they're not cities the way we traditionally think of. They're mostly ceremonial centers. And so you might have the priest living here on the top of this pyramid in the ceremonial center. He may live there full time. But then out in this kind of hinterland region, this area around the city-state, that's where most of the people who were governed live. They might live on a little farm here or on a little farm here, further back. And so on special occasions, the population comes from the farms into this ceremonial center where the priest does religious ceremonies, or maybe over here the king lives, and they do ceremonial centers with the priests. And so the government is happening in the ceremonial center, but most of the people live outside the city in their farms. And so we talked about this constant warfare. So here's a map of some of the discovered Mayan civilizations that we've kind of discovered and hacked back away from the jungle. And we know that these city-states, like I said, they're not all in one empire, and they're always fighting each other. They're fighting over resources, they're fighting over farmland, they're fighting over trade. And so it was this kind of constant state of alliance or war with one another that kept them busy. Society of the Mayan city-states. So obviously at the top, this guy with his fancy headdress with all of these parrot feathers, this is going to be the warrior king. He's going to be the guy in charge of making all the rules and laws for the city-state. Underneath him, we have priests. Now they have a high social status because they're the only ones that know how to contact the gods. They're the only ones that know the rituals and the sacrifices that you need to get the gods' attention to help you to make sure that you have successful year-growing crops or whatever. And so, since they're the only ones that can directly talk to the gods, they have a lot of status in society. Underneath them, we have the nobility. So as you can see, they're still dressed really nice. They have big hats, maybe not as nice as this one, but these are the people who own most of the land that the maybe smaller villagers farm on. And so they have lots of wealth, lots of power. They're also warriors. And we do see a few merchants in this class as well. Next, we see that they're down further in the social caste. Their clothing is a little bit less ornate, and these are artisans. These may be people that, I don't know, maybe they make baskets, as we see right here. Maybe these people are also making, selling some kind of cotton cloth, whatever. And so they have a skill, and so they're a little bit more valuable, so they're up there at the top. Then at the bottom, we have your common landless laborers, or maybe they have a small farm. And so you see how that they're not dressed very well. They just have basic clothes. These people mostly grow maize or cotton or some of the cacao, and sometimes they work for the nobility. They work on their land. They have to pay them taxes. And then also we have slaves. We have people that are captured in warfare, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so, let's talk about it now. And so, if we go back to the last slide, we talk about these warriors, right? So it is possible for people to go between classes. It's very uncommon, but it is possible. So how do you go from the artisan class or the small farmer class to be a higher warrior or noble class? Well, you win prestige in war. And so if you go out and raid a village for your city-state, maybe a rival city-state's village, and you capture your enemies, you can bring them back as sacrificial victims for the priests, or you can bring them back as slaves to work on your farm. And that raises the amount of labor you control, and so that makes you richer and higher your social status. Or maybe it raises your status because the priests now will do something special for you, where they like you, they look favor upon you, because you bring them captives for their sacrifices. So how does one become a slave? So we said that you can be captured in warfare, and you're brought back as a slave, either to be a slave or a sacrifice. Also, you could become a slave if you fell into debt or you fell out of favor, and so you could be kind of sold into slavery that way. So let's now talk about Mayan religion, because this will form the basis of later Aztec religion. And so the Mayan religion is polytheistic, which means they have many, many gods. And they're farmers primarily when they're not fighting. And so their nature gods are usually having to deal with farming. Like there's a goddess for fertility, there's a god of sun, there's a god of rain, those kind of things. All things that the farmers would need to pray to hopefully make their crops be more successful. And so these gods, they want something that is precious to us, for them to pay attention to us, right? You're not going to give them something that you don't care about. It doesn't have any meaning to you, and it won't have any meaning to the gods. And so the gods demand human blood, because of course that is the most precious thing we have. It's life itself. And so on most occasions, what the Mayan priests would do is they would give their own blood. And so here's a Mayan priest down here, and we can see that he has this string, and it has thorns on it. You can see them here. Here's a thorn, and here's a thorn, etc. And he has a hole in his tongue. His tongue is pierced, and so he would take out the stud, and then he would run this string with thorns on it through his tongue, and that, of course, would create a blood flow that would collect down here in this pot. And so this other priest is doing some kind of hymn or chant or prayer to make this holy, and so they would collect the blood and then offer it to the gods to get them to listen. Now, sometimes if you have something really important, like it's a really high holy day, or maybe there's been a drought for a while and we really need to capture the god's attention, or your city-state is in this all-out war and we're being threatened, at that point, the priest needs to give more than just his blood. He might give the blood of an entire victim. And so here we see this woman, and she's being thrown into a sinkhole. So in the Mayan Peninsula, I said there's lots of lime in the soil. And so here's the Earth's crust, and as it rains, right, it's raining, the water, what it does is limestone is very porous. It has lots of holes in it. And so the water just kind of quickly just goes through the soil into the sub-earth, right? And so what happens when limestone gets wet, it starts to disintegrate. And so underneath the surface of the Yucatan Peninsula, there's all these underground caves that have kind of worn away over time as the limestone is kind of disintegrated or melted by the water. Well, if this cave gets big enough, what happens is, let's say the cave gets bigger and bigger over time, there's just not enough earth on top of it to support weight, and so it collapses, and it makes this big, huge sinkhole in the earth with usually water at the bottom. And so what the Mayans do is they don't know why these sinkholes are there, they just know that they are there, and they appear sometimes. And so they thought that this maybe is how you contact the gods. And so they would throw this victim along with food and clothing and anything else that's precious to you into these sinkholes, offering to the gods. So today archaeologists sometimes can find these sinkholes, and if they're still covered with water, a lot of times they're perfectly preserved because a lot of oxygen hasn't been able to get to it, and so they see the remains of these sacrifices. They see human skeletons, and they see some of the pottery that was thrown in, and so this is how we know to some extent that these natives were doing this. Another thing that the Mayans would do is they would play these games of, it's like a mix of soccer today. So they have these big rubber balls, and the natives were not allowed to touch them. They could only hit them with their hips and legs. And these balls would have to be played between two teams, and the teams would try to get the ball through this target that had a hole in it on the side of the wall. There's one on each wall. And so sometimes, and whoever scores first wins, right? And sometimes these games would go on for days. Now later on, especially we'll see with the Aztecs as well, is that sometimes on these holy days, if things were really bad, they might sacrifice the losing team. And so these games became very serious over time. So that's Mayan religion. It's polytheistic, and it's a blood sacrifice religion at times. Next, let's talk about the intellectual achievements. Now, typically, farming societies have to have a good, accurate calendar. They need to know when the rainy season is and when the dry season is, when it's time to plant your crops and harvest the crops. And so it's important that they have an accurate calendar, so they tend to look at the stars, and the stars will tell them the seasons. And so we see that the Mayans spent a lot of time doing this because they thought that the gods were like in the heavens and also underneath the earth as well. And so they saw the stars as a way for them to kind of track the gods' wishes and movements. And so they have a very accurate 365-day calendar, which of course is very close to our calendar today. Now, what they had is in the center, here's a god, and he has his tongue out because he wants blood sacrifice. And then each of these things we see on the next circle, right? These are all symbols of a god, and they rotate. This circle rotates as we go through the days of the week. And then here's another circle that has even more gods, and this may be weeks. So we go through this circle in the inside very quickly of the days, and we've gone through a week. This circle clicks one over, and so you have an alignment of day gods versus week gods, and then we have month gods and year gods as we go out. All of these symbols represent different gods, and so as we go out and out the circle, each circle clicks through the center circle, circling faster, and so each day has this alignment of gods, and all of these different gods in this alignment will be read by the priests, and that'll tell you what kind of day it's going to be. It's kind of like we see astrologers do that today when they say, oh, the stars are aligned and this means you're going to have a good day or a bad day. Well, same kind of idea here. So if they might even believe that if you looked at the certain day a person was born, all of the gods align, whether it be a day, a week, a month god, or a year god, all of those would kind of determine your personality and whether you're going to have a good life or you're going to have a bad life, or what you need to look out for in your life. Now, so what happens is there are only so many combinations that this calendar can go through. And when it's gone through all of the possible combinations mathematically, then that's a 52-year cycle. And so the Mayas believed that when that cycle clicked back and zeroed back to the starting point, there would be some major change in the world, like the world is resetting. And so we see that we have this kind of cyclical belief in the religious system, which makes sense because years themselves are cyclical, and you have a planting, harvesting season, right? And then you plant again and harvest again. And so we see that there's this belief, and there's that the world resets again and again and again. Next, so we're kind of getting away from the calendar now, but they also invented, as far as the number system goes, they invented the concept of zero. And of course, zero is important in math if we need a placeholder. If you don't have a zero, then like the Romans, ancient Romans, they didn't have a zero. And so they had to have a new symbol for every number. And you can imagine if you're trying to do long division, that would get really hard. It would be really long numbers, and from just to study math, you'd have to study an infinite amount of numbers, symbols for the numbers. But if you have a zero, you can use that as a placeholder. And so just like we do today, you have to memorize 9 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then when you get to 10, you don't have to invent a new number. You just put the 0 where the 1s is, and then you can just start using 1 again. And so this makes it much easier to do math because you don't have to invent a new symbol for every number. And so they're going to be very good at math. Of course, they have to do that if they want to make a calendar. And so let's talk about their writing system. So the writing system is known as pictographic. So there's a picture for every word. And so here we see, here's the symbol for sky and person and mountain, etc. Some are kind of easy, like Lord. This looks like a rich man. Here's a woman, right? But some of them are harder to figure out, like book. And so we had seen that this can be a very easy language when it deals with things that are look like the word they're representing. But if you have 50,000 words in your language, which is fairly common, then you're going to have to memorize 50,000 symbols. So this was really hard for people to learn to read. So typically the only people that could read were the priestly class. They're the ones that are going to dedicate their life to learning to read. They don't have to work because all they do is learn to be a priest. And so they're typically the only ones that are literate. Everybody else in society, most of the people are farmers, and so they don't need to know how to read, and they have to spend their time farming anyway. So whenever you have a pictographic language, like you do in this culture, we're going to see the literacy rate is very low. But that also gives the priests more power because they're the only ones that can record things, right? They're the only ones that can record the great deeds of the king or his taxes that he's collected, or so the king depends on the priest class, or they're also the only ones that know the symbols to represent prayers, and they're the only ones that can read it, and so they have this kind of privileged status position. Now, Mayan decline. The simple answer is we don't know why they declined. We know sometime around 1100 their society disintegrates, and then we forget about them because their ceremonial centers, their city-states just kind of get covered up by the jungle. And so, every so often we'll see some archaeologists down in Mexico, they discover some new Mayan ruin and we kind of cut back the jungle and we find it. And so why did their society go away? Well, we think there is probably some environmental factors. We think that at the end of their decline, there was probably a prolonged drought, which meant that they didn't have enough rain, so starvation happened. And so that meant that cities had to start fighting whatever resources there were. We start to see war increase at this time, and maybe that war was caused by the drought. Maybe deforestation was the cause. Maybe as these people continued to farm more and more and more, they cut back the jungle. Whatever good soil there was, we talked about how they got it. Well, now, without trees to hold in the good soil, we see that erosion happens really fast. And maybe the system they had to catch the good soil wasn't fast enough because the trees will hold in some of the good soil, and that led to soil erosion, and so then there's no good soil at all to grow crops. There's no trees to cook your food, to build your structures. And maybe it was salinization. Salinization means that whenever you use cropland for too long, it starts to get a lot of salt built up in the soil, and when that happens, you can't grow anything in it. And so maybe that happened. Perhaps there was some kind of a plague or disease that swept through the civilization that killed the people. In any event, we don't know the reason, but we do know that people abandoned these cities and just went to live out in the countryside. And so Mayan civilization went in decline. And so that pretty much wraps up part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about Aztec society.